Hi friends, Brother Judd here with another lesson for this week's Institute. Thoroughly enjoying this course of living the restored gospel of Jesus Christ in troubling times. And this week we're going to look at a topic that we've kind of been looking at in weeks past. It touches on a lot of these things, but it's nice to have a lesson where we can talk about it directly. Before I get to that though, just a reminder that if you go over to institutemidwest.org, you can find our class schedule. Some students have been telling me, hey, you keep saying that, but it's hard to find. So if you go to the actual website and then you go to any of the calendars, just look for a calendar item named, Living the Gospel in Troubled Times or the Restored Gospel in Troubled Times, something like that. Click on it, and that's how you find all of the resources and the class schedule and whatnot that I mentioned. So we'll have class this week, and then we'll take the next week off for Thanksgiving break. And then once we come back, I believe that we just have a couple of classes left before we will break for winter and Christmas and New Year's and all of that. So those of you who have been with me from the beginning, thank you. Those of you who may be just jumping in this week, glad to have you along for the ride. And as always, we have discussion groups available Tuesday evenings, Wednesday afternoon. So definitely check those out if you want to plug in and give feedback, ask more questions, talk with other people. Really enjoy those discussion groups that we have. So this week's question may come in the form of something like this. Get a text from somebody, hey, Brother Judd, any thoughts as to why it feels like the church hid our real history from us for so long? Well, I think I understand your question, but tell me more. What do you mean by real history? Like seer stones, multiple accounts of the first vision, things like that. Why are we only hearing about these things now? And so my guess is, if you are participating in an Institute course like this, then these things may be on your mind, where you feel like the church may have been guilty of hiding its history for decades. Why didn't we hear about multiple accounts of the first vision? Why don't we talk more about racial restrictions? Why wasn't there a reckoning with, Joseph Smith's involvement in money digging and treasure seeking and using seer stones and folk magic traditions early in his life? Why didn't we talk about Joseph Smith being arrested maybe not arrested, but being brought to court on such things? Why haven't we known about this? And why does it feel like only now, here in 2020, that we're finally kind of owning up to these sticky wickets in church history? Well, definitely happy to talk about that. I don't know that I can give a specific reason for why are we being more transparent with our history now than, say, when I was a kid in the 1980s. You're right, we didn't hear a whole lot about Joseph Smith and seer stones. We didn't hear about multiple accounts of the first vision. We just kind of heard the standard version, the one that gets shared in Sunday school. And so I don't know that I can give a reason, a definitive reason for why the shift. I think I can, looking at larger trends in history and what's going on in the context, I've got some ideas as to why that is. But I definitely push back against the church was hiding these things from us. And I have some very specific things that I can share with you with regards to that. So grab your scriptures, your phone, your iPad, your laptop, whatever you're going to do, and pull up the old Google machine here, because as in weeks past, we're going to go to the LDS Newsroom site for some help. So LDS Newsroom, I've learned to put newsroom in quotes because that gives us a lot of the that'll restrict a lot of the search results to looking for newsroom sites. And so let's just take, for example, the first vision. Okay, so what can the good old newsroom help us out with regards to the first vision? So number of sites here, looks like there's one with regards to just the first vision. Here's an entry that says new podcast series looks in depth at Joseph Smith's first vision of deity. First vision some more things. First vision, President Nelson invites sharing of gospel restoration, church newsroom. So this podcast series looks the most interesting to me. Looks like this was just published back January 6, 2020. Pretty recent. And it talks about this new 6-episode podcast series from the editors of the Joseph Smith papers. Now, that's also something that we did not have available back in the 1980s, was this whole Joseph Smith Papers project. I don't know how many of you know exactly what that is, but definitely go over to Joseph Smith Papers, to their website. Let's see if there's a link here, links directly to it. I bet if I click on see, if I click on the link to this first episode, it takes us over here to the Joseph Smith Papers. Let's find out, what is the Joseph Smith Papers project? So it talks here about Joseph Smith and who he was. It says the Joseph Smith Paper Project is not a documentary history project comprising all important documents relating to Joseph Smith. Instead, it is a papers project. And so my guess is, to historians, those phrases in quotes, documentary history versus project, or versus papers in quotes, Papers project that will publish, according to accepted documentary editing standards, documents created by Joseph Smith or by staff, whose work he directed, including journals, revelations, and translations, contemporary reports of discourses, minutes, business and legal records, editorials, and notices. The project also includes papers received and owned by his office, such as incoming correspondence. So perhaps the question is, why did it take so long for such a papers project like this to be started? We've had these things for a long time. We have the church history library that has housed a lot of these things. I oftentimes hear about, oh, well, these things were locked away in the first presidency vault so no one could get access to them. That's just not true. We've had people, both supporters and critics of the church, who have been writing about these things for decades. And in some cases, they would use what was available there in the church history library to either support or to pull away from Joseph Smith's prophetic claims. These things have been available, but perhaps just not to the public in the way that the internet, which I think is part of the answer to this, the internet has made a lot of these things widely available. Whereas before, you would have to make the trek to the church history library, or to petition the church history department for access to such things, whereas the internet and the Joseph Smith Papers Project has indeed made a lot of these things available and accessible in a way heretofore where that just was not really an option. So I think that's part of the answer is, the internet has helped us make a lot more of these things public. But what about, just like, well, let's go here to First Vision. Just a very brief entry on First Vision. It says, see also First Vision accounts, which I'll definitely click on. And this takes us to First Vision accounts. Is this the Gospel Topics essay on the First Vision? Yep, Gospel Topics essays. This is the one on First Vision accounts. So the church has tried to be much more transparent with its history through these Gospel Topics essays, a number of which revolve around church history things. So First Vision accounts, Joseph's use of seer stones, involvements, Joseph Smith's involvements in polygamy in Kirtland and Nauvoo, early church violence with, Mountain Meadows Massacre and a few other things, the Mormon-Missouri War and whatnot. And these were not necessarily topics that were just talked about as you would go through your run-of-the-mill kind of curriculum standardized version of studying the Doctrine and Covenants or church history. So why the shift? This one goes through the First Vision accounts, talks about the ones that Joseph Smith publishes, goes through the 1832 account, the 35 account, goes through both the first-hand and the second-hand accounts. You can see these second-hand accounts here as well. I'm not going to necessarily go through the particulars of any one of these topics. That's not really the focus of this lesson. It's more on, did the church try and hide these things? And so that brings us to, well, what is the purpose of the church? Well, the church is a vehicle to help us get to Jesus Christ. I do not worship Joseph Smith, however, I am very grateful for him. I think I've mentioned in videos past that it is because of Joseph Smith that I was able to hang on to my faith in Jesus Christ. Apologies for the autobiography here for a minute, but as I was going through my undergraduate degree studying philosophy, those classes raised a lot of questions which were very critical of organized religion and critical of traditional Christianity. And as I would read these traditional arguments against God and specifically against Christianity, I found in the teachings of Joseph Smith and the Restored Gospel a lot of answers to these questions. I remember when I finished Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, putting that book down and thinking, praise to the man who communed with Jehovah, because Joseph Smith did, through the restoration and the revelations of the restoration, it provides so many answers that that atheists have been making against Christianity and theism in general for so long, and those arguments really don't hold up against what Joseph Smith had to teach us about who God is, who Jesus Christ is, what the plan of salvation is, the role of organized religion in all of these things. And so again, I do not worship Joseph Smith, but I am very, very grateful for him. And so if in putting our history together, there are things that make it difficult to believe in Joseph Smith and his prophetic ministry, I can definitely see those things being underplayed while elevating the things that make it easier to believe in the prophetic role of Joseph Smith. Hold on, Brother Jed, but that just seems like, we've got something to hide. Shouldn't we put everything out there? Well, this is kind of it's a modern invention where we have this uber fascination with transparency and let's just put everything out there as much as possible. Again, does the internet and social media have some responsibility for our over preoccupation with let's just put out all of the information that is possible? Perhaps. I'm sure we all know people who overshare on social media. They share things about their private lives that we would rather not know about. Does that mean that we just can't handle the truth about our friends or people that we know? What does that say that we just want to share and get everything out there? Now, a popular phrase is that light is the best disinfectant. I've personally always subscribed to the mantra of when in doubt, talk it out. So if I myself have had, concerns about should I talk about this with somebody, I usually do. I err on the side of let's talk about things, which may perhaps explain some of why I'm doing this Institute course is, let's talk about these things. Now, is there ever an appropriate time when we just do not talk about something? There are things personal to my family that I am not going to volunteer. Not that were those things to come out in the open, that it would destroy the reputation of my family or anything like that. But no, it just would not be appropriate. There are things, especially with regards to the relationship I have with my wife, that I don't just put out there for public consumption. But again, those are private relationships, and we're talking about a very public church. So I recognize that there is a big difference there, but I'm just using it as kind of an analogy to get us kind of down the road. So what happens here, and I feel like this was best articulated in a book that Brother Terrell Givens wrote. I'll show it to you here real quick. It's called Wrestling the Angel. Oops, got to spell that right. And in this book, here's a picture of it. Brother Givens, he goes through and he gives kind of an intellectual history of how the church presented itself. And so when you look at the days of Joseph Smith, there wasn't much of a history to present. It was just Joseph Smith and his first vision experiences and his angelic visitations and his publication of the Book of Mormon and the restoration of the church. Well, the early missionaries, they really did not peg a whole lot on Joseph Smith's first vision. They really just put a whole lot of emphasis on the Book of Mormon, and that was the evidence for Joseph Smith's prophetic calling. It isn't until later when people start to tell the story of the church that they say Joseph Smith and the first vision and whatnot, which I totally get. That makes sense. But then what happens is as we kind of move through time, and Joseph and those who were firsthand witnesses of the restoration events, as they die off, then kind of the next generation, they pick up these stories, and as oftentimes happens, they emphasize the really faith-promoting parts, and they de-emphasize the parts that they feel like people may have a difficult time with. And so some of those may be the multiple accounts of the first vision, or Joseph Smith's involvement in digging for buried treasure and folk magic and seer stones and things like that. Now, those stories, as they were told, and we have historical accounts of people hearing those stories, it was not that big of a deal because it was still much closer to the culture with which they were comfortable than, say, a modern reader here in 2020 would be comfortable with. And so, again, those stories, not really a big deal. They understood the context of those things. And so we have them talking about seer stones, and we have them talking about, Joseph Smith said this at one time, but then he said something else at another time about them. And that was okay because you could still, well, so-and-so was there, let's ask them about it. So it was very easy to do. But then as we move more generations, and this is something that Terrell Givens brings out, is we have the establishing of a church history department and a church historian. You have people who feel like, well, we need to protect the history, and we need to present a version of the church's history that goes down as easily as possible. We're already butting up against traditional Christian claims, of which when we show up and we say, hey, there was a great apostasy and a restoration, that's still a hard sell as it is. And so let's try to, I don't want to use the word sanitize, but I guess it's the word that's probably most apropos to the topic, to sanitize, to refine the history as much as possible. So as we go forward and we present the missionary message, that people get the best version of the restoration story as possible. But as time goes on, the story really kind of, does it get over-sanitized? Possibly, but definitely the story that is told in missionary messages and the story that is told to children, that should not be the only story that gets told. We ought to have an accurate and complete history that is told, and for those who were willing to jump in and really do the homework, those stories have been consistently told. So I'm going to go back here to the church's newsroom site, LDS, in quotes, newsroom, history, and see what that turns up for us. So here we have learn more about Mormon history, history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a brief history of Mormon publishing. Oh, that's interesting. Haven't seen that one before. Let's see. This article doesn't give us a date, but it does say, I'm going to start reading this paragraph here. During the early days of the church, nearly every region had its own individual publication. Some areas with more than one. In the 1830s, church members in Kirtland, Ohio read the LES Messenger and Advocate, the Elders Journal, the Gospel Reflector in Philadelphia, and in New York, the Prophet. So everybody's kind of supplying their own church publications. Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, they published the Times and Seasons. In Great Britain, they published the Millennial Star. Then once they get out to Council Bluffs, Iowa, they established the Frontier Guardian. You can keep going through this and you can see the multiple publication attempts of Latter-day Saints to try and talk to each other and also talk to people outside of the church to explain who we are and what our missionary efforts are and what our history is. And when you go through all of these different things, so the Friend and the Liahona, George Buchanan's establishing of the Juvenile Instructor, we move up to where James E. Talmage in 1930, he publishes the Comprehensive History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. B.H. Roberts is the general authority who actually does that, but it was there. Let's see. I read that whole paragraph so I make sure I get it right. Initially charged with publishing lesson manuals, Deseret Book also produced significant titles in church literature, including Jesus the Christ by James E. Talmage. Apologies for misreading that. So he writes Jesus the Christ, and then Elder Roberts comes out with the comprehensive history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints around the same time. Through all these publishing projects, different publishing projects were aimed at doing different things and talking to different audiences, and also somewhat speaking to the expectation of the people at the time. So here's possibly another explanation of the church doing its own history, and why does that history look a little different now than it did, say, back when B.H. Roberts was publishing his exhaustive history of the church, or his comprehensive history of the church. History's been done differently. You look at what historians are learning in grad school today about how to do history, and it looks a lot different than what historians were doing say back in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. We've seen cultural values really shift, societal values shift, where earlier cultural cohesion and loyalty were very, very, very important. And so you would see histories of America written that were very loyal to the founding fathers. Today, there's a trend to really try and pull and pick away at the virtues of the founding fathers and say, really, they weren't as good as they think they are. And so a term in history is that you write hagiographies. So a hagiography is something that overly romanticizes somebody. So let's say that you had an early history of Christopher Columbus, which portrays him as somebody who could do no wrong. That would be a hagiography. Or, George Washington could not tell a lie. Or whatever. It's these overly flowery interpretations of figures in history that are important to the historians who are writing those histories. And so a hagiography is really only portraying the good aspects of someone, where now, and through critical theory and looking at, really nobody, nothing is holy, nothing is sacred, we just want to tell the story how it actually is. Well, even then, if we're overly preoccupied with, we've just got to focus on the misdeeds of these people. Now, there's not a real good term for that. Like we have hagiography on the one side. You would have kind of iconoclasts, I guess, who are just trying to pull down the icons of history and destroy those and say, Columbus was terrible in this, and that areas and aspects of his life, so we should really not look at anything good that he did. Or George Washington, amongst a number of the other founding fathers, they were guilty of slavery, and so there's really nothing else good that they could do in their lives. In the Bible, we've got King David, who did a lot of things that were very good at the beginning of his life, but eventually with Bathsheba and Uriah, he falls for any number of things and misdeeds for which he loses. Eventually will lose his exaltation as the king of Israel. And so it's tough writing history, because history is rarely just, straight up and down objectively written. Historians have projects that they're trying to complete. They are speaking to the time in which they write these histories. There are expectations of them. They are trying to get published. And so while we would want to establish objective tellings of history as best as we can, we have to recognize that historians they have their own biases, their publishers have their own biases, the time in which they are writing have their own bias. A historian who is trying to publish a history that was being written in, say, the 1930s wouldn't have a chance of being published today. But back then, no problem at all. And so does that mean that history has changed? Well, isn't that one of the claims of history, that, hey, history is just history? No, it's still people who are producing these things. And so we try to get behind, well, what were their motives for writing such things? And I think the correlated, sanitized version of church history that a lot of us grew up with, it was reflective of history being done a different way. Now, if we were still trying to hold on to that same version of history, I'd be one of the first to say, hold on, we've not really where we're at anymore. We've got to move past that. And I'm so grateful that we do. We have these gospel topics essays. So when we come here to topics, you'll see here at the church newsroom all types of topics. And so let's say if I were to go to, I don't know, any number of things. Let's take First Vision, for example. Actually, I don't know if First Vision will be included in this one, because this is the newsroom site. But maybe it will. Yeah, First Vision, right there. Now, this was just the little one that we had before. I want to click on additional resources. Yeah, it's taking us all to the same place. But these were things that weren't available, and, I lament the fact that if somebody would have brought up, well, actually there are multiple First Vision accounts, they would have been made to feel very uncomfortable in a Sunday school in the 80s or 90s or the early 2000s. People would have questioned their loyalty to the prophet Joseph Smith because that was not the discourse at that time. Thankfully, we've moved past that. Not only are we publishing all of the First Vision accounts where everyone can readily access them on the church's internet properties, but there was that whole podcast that was dedicated to talking about the multiple First Vision accounts. We have church historians who give firesides on the topics and, institute classes where, we've talked very openly and studied the multiple accounts of the First Vision. Times have shifted, and our expectations as to how the church does its history, that has shifted as well, and the church has changed, thankfully. It's changed its method for how it does history, and for that, I am entirely grateful. So, long explanation to, was the church trying to hide its history? By modern standards, or by contemporary standards, it sure looks that way. I don't know if anyone would have really accused the church of hiding its history back when the expectations were different. Now, sure, you had people who were really getting into the history and looking at, well, why isn't this more a part of things? President Nelson himself, I think it was an Ensign article in like 1997, something like that. He's referring to seer stones clear back then. We have BYU religion professors who were writing about the multiple accounts of the First Vision, in the mid to late 60s. I mean, if you're really looking, you can see, yes, we had, spokespeople for the church who were talking and publishing these things, but it wasn't hitting the general church membership because the general church membership really wasn't that interested at the time. They were happy with, what's in the curriculum, what's in the Sunday school lessons, what's being taught in seminary. It doesn't cut it today, but back then it was probably okay for the time. But we've moved past, we do get into the complexities of history, and people tend to want to know everything. We live in the information age, and so the church is supplying that more information. Perhaps one framing that I found very helpful, hopefully you find it helpful as well. This framing comes from Elder Bruce Hafen and his wife Marie Hafen. They wrote a book called Faith is Not Blind. It's a fantastic book. Definitely recommend you pick it up. If you don't want to buy the book, you can put Elder and Sister Hafen Fireside. There's one from the University of BYU Hawaii where they kind of share this whole idea that I'm going to present here. But they kind of liken our understanding of church history and talking about complex issues in the church. They kind of use this metaphor of a hill. And so with this hill, they talk about simplicity being on one side of the hill, and we're moving from left to right. And so a lot of us, we grow up on this simple side of the hill. And we have the simple stories that are told to us in the scripture and Sunday school lessons in seminary and whatnot. And they're the simple versions. They don't tell us everything we need to know about things, but it's just it's appropriate for the age and it's appropriate for the time. But as we move through this, we start to, and as we get older, not only do we experience, but we start to demand more complexity. And I feel like that's a perfectly fine expectation. And so we move through the complexity, and as you'll see, this curve is rather steep. And as we start walking up this mountain of complexity, some of us don't like it. And we're like, ooh, this is hard. And so we want to retreat right back into simplicity. And sometimes there can be this anti-intellectual flavor that those who want to retreat back to simplicity, it can take that on. People be like, oh, well, that doesn't matter for my salvation. And while I can understand that concern to a certain extent, it's not the way I roll. I tend to want to bang my head through every theological and historical complexity that there is. But I think we need to recognize that some people, it's not their game, not what they want to do. Do they still have a viable place in the church? Of course. Not everyone is going to want to go through all the complex stuff. They're happy with the simplicity that they know. But those of us who do decide to climb Mount Complexity, we do this, and it's tough. Some of us, like I said, we want to retreat back to what we know. But if we're willing to put in the work and keep asking the questions, we climb through this, and what do we find on the other side? Well, we find, and I apologize for writing that so illegibly, we find simplicity on the other side as well. Now, what do you mean we find simplicity on the other side? They take this idea from a quote of a former justice, U.S. justice. His name was Oliver Wendell Holmes, where he said, I could shake a fig at simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my all for the simplicity on the other side of complexity. So, for example, in my own experience, grew up, my father was a religious educator. I was exposed to some of the complexities of Joseph Smith's life and ministry, perhaps earlier than some people were. But it was still a very simple testimony of, yes, I believe that Joseph Smith is a prophet called of God. As I start working through the complexity, I learn about seer stones, and I learn about treasure digging, and I learn about polygamy, and I learn about his destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor printing press. And you learn about some of the more complex things in Joseph Smith's life. And I come to terms with those. I learn about those. I petition heaven for help. And the testimony that eventually distilled on me was the same over here as it was over here. I still have a very simple testimony that I know Joseph Smith is a called prophet, the prophet of the restoration. That testimony is still as simple on the other side of complexity, and all of the reading and study and talking and discussing. It's the same testimony here that I had over here. It's the simplicity on the other side of complexity. A more real life example is my wife and I, we moved to the Chicago area about 8 years ago. We leave the simplicity that we knew of being surrounded by family and friends. We moved to Chicago's South Side. We leave our single-family home with a fenced yard and a garage for a 6-flat apartment in Chicago's Hyde Park neighborhood, where you had to fight for street parking, and it didn't seem like the streets ever. Well, the streets did. The sidewalks never got the snow taken care of, which was tough when you were raising 4 small kids and 2 of them were in strollers. Pushing strollers through the snow is no fun, especially when you're walking back and forth to school 6 times a day. You know, we'd take all of the kids there in the morning, walk home. We'd go back at midday, pick up our preschooler, come home. Go back at the end of day, pick the other 2 up, and come back. It was great as far as, your health is concerned, but pushing that stroller through the snow, no fun. Anyway, there were lots of times where we thought, we don't want to do this. Why did we come to Chicago? But through a lot of prayer, my wife and I holding on to one another, a lot of good friends that we made in the ward and the community there in Hyde Park, eventually we pushed through that complexity, and we came to really love living in that neighborhood. And we've come to love the Chicago area. And so now, where our complexity was this feeling of familiarity that we felt before we moved to Chicago, now we can't imagine moving anywhere else. We've found friends, we've found comfort, we've found a good situation. We're on the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And I get it. Moving through mountain complexity is super, super hard. But it's vital. I wonder if, the simplistic, or I'm not going to say simplistic, the simple versions of church history that were taught in the past, they were okay for the time, but I don't know that they were ever expected to be enough. The Lord demands of us that we put into understanding His interactions with His covenant people. It is an arduous, difficult, complex process that's going to take some real soul searching and effort. If we outsource our understanding of all of this to just what's in a published manual, I don't know that the Lord is always going to be pleased with us. But it's going to take what's in the published manuals. It's going to take some personal prayer. It's going to take really diving into Scripture and wrestling through some of these things to really come to terms with it. So I don't know if that was helpful at all. I definitely would push back hard against the church has been trying to hide its history. No, it was supplying a history where the expectations for history were different then than they are now. And now as those societal expectations has shifted, so has the method through which the church does its history, for which I'm grateful. If they weren't, I'd be saying, hey, I got a complaint about that. I tried to express that complaint in a calm, measured way, but you bet. I'd say it's time to move past. We've got to do some new things with the new generation. And gratefully, I believe we're doing that, and the church is doing that. And as Richard Bushman, he wrote a biography on Joseph Smith. He's a stake patriarch himself, believer. He wrote that just wonderful biography about Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. Now, some people, when they read that, they're like, oh, I can't believe in Joseph Smith anymore. Well, I think that has more to say about us than it has to say about the author. The author wrote it. He's still sticking around. I've read it, love it, recommended it to lots of people. And as we move through the complexities found in that and other biographies, testimonies of Joseph Smith are strengthened. Anyway, Brother Bushman, he remarked that perhaps this is just a one-generation problem, where we find ourselves kind of moving past a generation that really, really valued communal loyalty, and now we've moved into a generation where it's all about transparency and openness. And as we get stuck in that generational shift, I think that may be from where some of our discomfort comes. But, my kids are growing up with the story of, yes, Joseph Smith used the Nephite interpreters, and he used seer stones to translate and interpret the Book of Mormon. They're growing up with this stuff. And so it may just be a single generation problem. So to those of you who have gotten stuck and mired down in some of this intergenerational difficulty, my heart goes out to you. Please come to Institute, fire me an email, a text, give me a phone call, whatever. Let me see if I can help you climb Mount Complexity and come rest eventually on that other side, on that simplicity that is indeed there. My testimony is simple. Joseph Smith, the Restoration, they're divine projects. They're divine projects with human fingerprints smudged all over them. But that doesn't mean they're any less divine. That's just evidence that God indeed works through the frail, the weak, the small things of the world to bring to pass His great purposes. And I share that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.